So I thought that it might be interesting to talk about this album with you and to spend a little bit of time kind of introducing you to the way that I've been working with this current project. And it hasn't been easy at all. It's been a really long time coming, and I wanted to explain the different stages of what you're hearing. And I think it's very obvious when you play through the album. You can hear the different stages. And it's intentional. You can definitely hear the elements changing, and therefore the results changing. As you scale the album and move from beginning to end, it's almost like it's like a gentle ride where you suddenly get punched in the face, and then you continue through, and things change. The carpet gets pulled out from under your feet, and you don't maybe not expect that. But it is fundamentally still an album, but that's not where it started. Now let's go back to the beginning. I just released my first Call of Duty related album, which is called Zombies, or technically Zombies 1. And I had some kind of insider information about something coming up called Extinction. And at the time, I wasn't really sure what it was about, but it always sounded like something extraterrestrial. And for that reason, I started getting far more interested in things that I haven't been interested in for the best part of 15 years, namely synthesis and synthesizers and the ability to create sounds from the ground up. You know, as a producer, it's very easy to get locked into Pro Tools or locked into whatever, it doesn't matter, Reactor, and it's very difficult to train yourself to not use presets. And I hate the term preset, but it's something that it's irritated me for a long time, because what you eventually find is that people with no education when it comes to production and synthesis are able to get really good sounds by cheating. And I come from a generation of people who, technically I'm a generation late, but I was still using synthesis up until maybe 10 years ago. Then it all became very much digitized. Even synthesis became digitized with the kind of mini Moogs and stuff coming through, or were at least affordable to me then. It became far more lazy in that respect, because the fundamental thing that I love about synthesis and synthesizers is you start with a sine wave. You can start with a square wave if you want, but I always start with a sine wave. And you torture that sine wave. You bleed it dry. You change it. You cut off its hands. You give it a blood transfusion. You do all these things to it to make it something that it didn't want to be. That sine wave is so pure. For those of you who don't know what a sine wave, it's the purest type of wave, and it sounds like a tone. But it's something that it's such an interesting place to start. And you know, I came to synthesis late. I started with Akai synths and ADSL and ADSR and all that stuff, and it took me a long time to come back around to, or to even to begin to care about where it came from, because you know, the Akais and sampling, that's all very late in terms of synthesis. And so as I say, I had this idea that it was going to be an extraterrestrially based game. And then I started doing my research. Now, it's the first time, well, it's not the first time, but it's the first time in a long time that I've done research on a project, because everything else has been it's kind of been handed to me. But this wasn't handed to me. This was presented to me like a case study that I had to study to understand what this new feature, this new game would be about. It wasn't presented to me quite like The zombie stuff is, where it's literally given to me and I just make songs about it. So the first thing, I didn't know that it was going to be aliens. I always thought it was because Extinction sounds like that. So I had a place to start with, but I was never sure. And I think you can hear that in some of the earlier songs in the album. You're not quite sure. I'm not sure where I'm treading in terms of the actual integrity of those songs. I think the integrity is compromised because I didn't have a distinct agenda when it came to starting those. And I think that shines through. But I like that. It gives this album... And I always like albums, and there are a few that I can think of right now, One by the Trees especially, but there are albums that make you feel distinctly uncomfortable. And I have a project at the moment called Diplomat, which is almost entirely based on making you feel horrendous. Well, and other things, but mainly horrendous, basically, throughout its playtime. And I like the idea of making the listener feel not just happy, because there are so many happy songs on the radio, and that's boring to me now. I think that the pop thing for me is really wearing off, and I've never been a pop guy, although I did make some poppy kind of stuff before, and now I just feel like it's my time to get honest with what I want to make, and to portray that in a way that affects you. That's kind of my reasoning anyway. So as I said, I came to synthesis late, and I started doing my research. Now there are amazing films, there are amazing books as well about aliens and invasions. Not just about aliens, about different kinds of people, and in fact the entire premise of Diplomat is based on historical truth, which is unbelievable for you at the moment, but that's something that's really, really fun to make. But there's so much documentation about aliens, and of course we don't. Well, if the universe is infinite, then aliens do exist, of course. But I've never seen one. I've never been abducted, so it's hard to get a grasp on what you want to think of as aliens, because of course at the time, and even today, there hasn't been a trailer for Extinction. I don't know what it's going to be. And the thing is, I've now made an entire album about a game that I haven't had a single detail about or seen anything. I don't know what the aliens, if they are aliens, I don't know what they look like. I don't know anything. So this is a real step out of my comfort zone. So let's hope I get at least some of it right, because otherwise it would be completely inane. But I have a feeling I'm onto something. So as I said, my research, and when I say research, I don't mean research into aliens, I mean research into what other composers have done and used to create that feel of an otherworldly experience. That was the fundamentally most important thing to this venture, was to get the right set of tools to create something that stood the test of time in terms of what I'm doing now. And I don't have the tools to do that, mainly because those tools are extraordinarily expensive. And but I did have them for the album. Now I'll take you back a bit. Where I work is at a project studio, and I've worked here for 6 years, something like that, and it's perfect for pretty much every type of, apart from orchestral stuff. It's not big enough for orchestral. It's perfect for everything that I'm doing. And what it doesn't have is a particularly good selection of synthesizers or synthesis-based tools. And what I didn't want to do at all for this album was to go into Pro Tools and just bring up some synthesizer that I've used 1,000 times. No, not real synthesizer, just something that, unafforded synthesizer. I didn't want to do that because everyone does that, and I've done that in the past. And what you end up is using someone else's preset, and I don't want to do that. I wanted to start from the ground up, and so I had to get in touch with museums. I mean, it's the first time I've called a museum, I think, in my life. It's the first time I've ever rented gear, because I mean the gear that I use here, some of it isn't dramatically expensive, and so I'm able to afford it. But there are some pieces of gear that really do exceed the kind of budget I want to be spending for synthesizers for this one project. Now, there is a really classic film. Can you be really classic? I don't know. There is a classic film called Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and it's that film has stood to the test of time in terms of extraterrestrially based pieces of media, and the production and the score and the composition of that entire film is it's almost regal. It's that good that it should be afforded so much praise. Yet I think it's kind of underrated. I really do. And there's a sequence in that film, I believe it's called Landing Sequence or something like that, where this alien spacecraft, I don't want to spoil it, but this alien spacecraft lands on Earth. And there's a big kind of structure at the back that has lights on it, and it lights up every time, and these lights light up every time that someone plays a note on this synthesizer. And so I thought, well, that sounds amazing. This is such a seminal piece of film history. And I thought, A, how do I get a piece of gear like that? And B, how do I afford a piece of gear like that? I'm going to have to sell my car, my organs to buy something like that. So I got in touch with a museum in Toronto who allowed me to rent it, physically rent something called an ARP. And there was actually 2 ARPs used on the album. The second one was the Avatar, and that came from London. But this other one came from Toronto, and this was not the one in the film, but this was one that was identical to the one in the film. It's a monophonic modular synth. And you hear it on every track, I believe, apart from... there's 2 tracks actually that's not on, but you hear it almost entirely throughout the album, and in different ways. There's a kind of there's a song called it was currently called Abattoir Earth, and at the beginning of that, there's this kind of weird fluttery bird-esque sound that never came from that. It started from a sine wave, and due to this kind of modular-based patching system, I was able to reroute and sidechain this effect so that it affected itself. And suddenly after about 8 hours of sculpting this sine wave, I had this amazing bird-like tweeting sound. And I loved it. I can't explain it. It's between a bird and a crowd of people. It's somewhere in there. And slowly during the song, I think of the first 30 seconds, it gets degraded by using some... actually, I think the technical term for the actual product name is a butt probe, but it's basically... I was going to say it's a butt probe that is basically like a big muff. But for people who know how to play guitar and are familiar with guitar pedals, there is a guitar pedal called a big muff, and that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not trying to be... These aren't innuendos, these are just facts. But the butt probe is similar to the big muff. And slowly that is getting distorted and degraded to the point where the drums, and there's a backbeat drum that comes in, suddenly you have this kind of weird twisted harmonic distortion above this beat that's kind of surrounding it, and that is just this sound that's being gently destroyed. And I mean, it was a long time just to create that one sound, but I think it's worth it because, I could have gone into whatever on Logic or on I use Pro Tools, but there's Logic synthesizers that will do the same thing, but not really. I mean, I'd like to think that what I'm making with this album is slightly different to what's available from a preset list of noises, essentially. So that was a huge step for me to actually get back to kind of underground synthesis, because what I've been using are kind of microcorgs, the elect tribes for the MPC stuff. I use Korg elect tribes, as well as I've got a Voyager, a Moog, Mini Moog. I've got a lot of gear, but none of it sounds like what I wanted. Or if it does sound like it, it feels like it's trying to sound like it, and that's not good enough for me. So I had to go back to the place that I knew that I could get a fundamentally impressive and impressionable in a way, because it had an impression on me, at least sound. And so I had to go through this. I haven't got it anymore, unfortunately, because I had to go back, and it was extraordinarily expensive just to rent it, but it's back in Toronto now, and now it's safe. But I was very, very honoured to be someone who was allowed to play with the ARP. I had two ARPs, actually. The second was an Avatar, which is a much smaller piece of kit, because the monophonic analog synth is huge, it's modular, and I think it's one large module in the middle, and then the two on the sides both have their own. Actually, no, one has oscillators and the other one is literally just like an effects-based rerouting and sidechaining system. So it's not. It was huge. I mean, it was gigantic. It looked like you were sitting in a pilot's cockpit and you had this thing in front of you. So I did feel quite special. But the Avatar was much smaller. The ARP Avatar is used on The Apostle's Gaze a lot. It's on 2 or 3 other songs as well. And from the ground up, I mean, starting with kind of corrupt sine waves, square waves, sorry, is an interesting place when you're trying to create bass lines. And it was a truly wonderful experience. In fact, if I could, I probably could have bought that now just about, but that would be the next thing that I bought. If I was going to buy anything now, it would definitely be an Avatar. And I really enjoyed that. There are a couple of other things that I used. Some things that were new to me in terms of synthesis. One was called a Macbeth X series. I think it's called a Micro Mac R. And again, with the song Abattoir Earth, there's this kind of drone-like bass sound, which from the beginning, almost all the way through the song, that kind of hurts to listen to it. It's not a nice sound. It's obviously not designed to be nice. I'm not trying to make nice music, but it's something that was difficult to create, because when you spend 11 hours or whatever it is, that was probably more than that for that, when you try and spend that amount of time creating something that sounds like that, it's very difficult to listen to it for a really long period of time, because your mind just starts to melt and drop off. You start to lose synapses, and your amoebas just start committing suicide. And so I just think it's probably not the best thing to be doing. But that one sound typifies what I wanted to do with this album, was to create something that sounds just like Doom. It is the sonic personification of Doom. And that was what I was trying to do with this album. Some of the songs, like there are a couple of Trespassers as a current working title for a song. That will be changed probably to Unstoppable, I think, though, when it comes out. That song sounds like, sonically, it sounds quite happy. And so there was this moment where I was creating major, and that means kind of slightly more happy in inverted commas. It's not really, but major music sounds happy in general, and it's more major than any other song I think on the album, and it kind of felt like it didn't fit with the album for a long time, until I put lyrics on it, at which point the lyrics are quite depressing, although it's kind of one of those songs where it's a kind of fall to the floor, back up against the wall kind of thing. It's not, for some reason I feel depressed when I sing it. It didn't come from a particularly happy place, and so I think that I think you do feel that, and in that way I think the song now fits in with the kind of architecture of the album, and so that was really fun. There were a couple of other synths that I used that I'm not at all familiar with more. One was actually used on Star Trek, and I'm not a Star Trek fan. Well, I've watched Star Trek. I don't mind it. It's just I'm not very good at Star Trek, so I don't know where it came from. But a friend of mine called Brian had a Com Brio, or Brio, I think you're supposed to call it, and it's an ADS. Oh, I think it's a 200 or 2000. I can't remember what it's called. And it was apparently used on a Star Trek, either in an episode of Star Trek or in a movie. I don't really know. And that was amazing. I had the most fun of all the synths that came for this period. That was just... The noises that come out of this thing are either gut-wrenchingly disturbing and weird, or just like so happy that you just have to start dancing. And so it was really good fun. That was the most schizophrenic synth I think I'll ever use. There are things like Polyfusion SP1s and stuff which I kind of... I've had those around. I've worked in studios and been producing music where those have been a kind of fundamental. So other than that, let's talk about the kind of structure of the album. And as you probably know by now, when I make albums, especially for Call of Duty, I have a story-based narrative that runs through, because I like the idea of, the music complementing that narrative and the narrative complementing that music, because sometimes it's hard to say what you want to say in lyrics. Sometimes it's difficult to do that, especially when it's a game, because this is the hardest I've had to work to try and put myself in the position of someone affected by the current ongoings in this game. But it's quite difficult to write from that kind of perspective, because it's not your emotions. You're having to impart your soul into what is a hypothetical person to try and render some sense of emotion, and that is quite difficult to do. And I have struggled with that, if I'm honest. It's not something I'm particularly good. I'm actually not a good lyric writer. It takes me a long time to write what I think are good lyrics, whereas I know people who can come to the studio in one day and just use sheets of what seem to me like amazing things. I don't work that way. I have to really take my kind of notes away for lyrics, sit with them for weeks, and I do procrastinate a bit with lyrics, because I never enjoy the lyric writing process, mainly because it is so long and I'm so unconvinced by my own ability to speak English. And I don't know why, because I can speak English. I'm speaking it now, but for some reason I think that I'm some way jeopardized in the lyric writing process. So anyway, that's something that's different. So this narrative that I'm installing into this album, again, I don't know if it's true, and I'm hoping it is true. I have some rumblings, but and I think it's going to come out almost spot on. The only thing is, I don't think the game, to all intensive purposes, because I know the people who are making the game, I don't think the game isn't necessarily about abduction kind of aliens, although in my narrative on the album it is about abduction. And I think there will be this distinct difference between the aliens that you find in-game and the ones on my album. Now, let me explain this thought process to you. Okay, so I believe in the future we're going to see a Call of Duty Extinction mode, obviously. That should be obvious by now. And it's going to be a run-and-gun alien shooter, maybe wave defense, maybe area defense. I don't know, but that's in my head. That's what it's going to be. It may be linear, it may not be. I really don't know. What I don't think is that those aliens are going to be cognitive beings. I don't think they're going to have the ability to communicate with the humans. I'm not sure, but that's what I think now. Now, the aliens on my album, they're just referred to as them, and they are really eloquent, human-sounding people. Now, there's a reason for this. The person who's been abducted in my album is, in my mind's eye, I saw him sitting on or lying down on a table, essentially being operated on by an unknown entity, because he couldn't open his eyes. He was literally in his mind, and he couldn't see anything. He could barely hear anything, but he could feel what was going on, but essentially couldn't respond to those powerful nerve endings firing. He couldn't do that. what the aliens or them were doing in my narrative was installing themselves in his mind, and we're getting to him that way, and we're able to communicate with him in that way. And we went through a number of varieties when it came to tracking the vocals for the or tracking the narrative for the kind of interjecting narrative portions. We went through a lot of different kind of types, and at first they were going to be very alien sounding, very affected with effects and stuff. And after a while I thought, well, if they're in his head, if they've installed themselves in his head and are trying to communicate, they're probably not going to sound like an alien to him. In order to communicate with him, they're probably going to have to sound human-ish. And then I thought, what is the most sinister sounding human? And then I came back to just films and media and just some, horrendous films in some way. But if you think of Clockwork Orange and Stanley Kubrick, this series of men, and there's thousands of movies that have sinister people. And if you look at Bane in the new Batman, he's actually a rather eloquent, posh sounding person. And for some reason that stays with you. It wouldn't stay with you as long, I don't think, if he sounded a bit rough, or if he sounded a bit like he wasn't pronouncing, he wasn't crossing his T's and fisting his I's, as Robert Robertson would say. But he sounded really sinister because he had this eloquence. And so I think that they need to sound refined. And that was the key, I think, to making them appear sinister in at least my narrative. So yeah, that's it. There are a couple of opuses which didn't actually reach the album, or they're in the album, you will have heard them, but they won't have been their own tracks because at the time I didn't think that was particularly necessary. In fact, they were greatly reduced as well. I had two opuses to begin with, two pieces of it's almost classical music, but done with synthesizers, and I may release them in full in the end so you can hear where they were on those songs, because some of the songs on the album seem to drone and drift into one another, and that was a big part of making the album flow, because it didn't flow particularly well to begin with. But now I think from start to end you can tell that it has a decision has been made to make that album and to craft that album and to chisel off the things that didn't work. And I think that now it sounds like a coherent and competent, at least from my perspective, it's something that I'm very proud of. And it's probably the most fun I've had making music in 10 years, maybe. It gets really stagnant working in the box. And so then when you take yourself outside the box, for instance, on I think every track that has drums on them were done with my Double N Mapex kit, which is a custom kit. Were all done by me. Whereas before, I'd sample my drum kit. I'd always sample. I'd never use whatever they're called. I don't even know what they're called. But I always sampled my own drum kit and used my drum kit because I liked doing that. I've been used to sampling and I enjoyed doing that. I like the whole process of that. But there was no sampling. All of it was done live, and then I'd add Akai MPCs on top, some original kind of 909s, 808s, to try and, although they're a bit crushed and their bit depth has dropped to maybe 2 or 4, but they're all there and they kind of make the drums. It just sounds rough. The drums don't sound particularly kind of poppy and nice, but that's all because I don't like that. And this whole project, if it did sound too poppy and nice, it wouldn't be what it's supposed to be. And that's it. The other thing I didn't want to do was to have... I wanted you to take away that this wasn't necessarily going to start as an album. I had this idea in my head for a long time, and as I was talking about the opuses then, was to create a kind of generally moving piece of music that would be one track. and it would be 43 minutes long, but it would be one track, so that you couldn't skip to a track that you liked. They would just kind of... It would be a very cheap album as well, because it would be literally 99 cents or pounds. Well, not 99 pounds, pence. But it would be just this general playthrough, and this drone of... And the rigmarole of having to just, literally track through to get to where you want it to be. That was something that I really enjoyed, but then when it actually came down to finalising and mastering the album, it couldn't be like that, because mastering it would have been undoable. So unfortunately, when the mastering process came, we literally had to cut up that one piece of audio and take out a lot, unfortunately. But I may eventually... Actually, I will definitely share the full version at some point in the distant future, I'm sure, because it is different and it plays differently. It doesn't play better particularly, it just plays differently, and that's it. So the album is kind of about, and there are some tracks on it which really get me like a lump in the throat when I play them, but just some of them, I just think it's so depressing, because it's such a... and I've covered the subject many times in the past of the end of the world, and in different ways. But when you come down to the kind of human element of the end of the world, it's something that it's really scary. It is really scary, and it can take you into a really dark place. And, I didn't want to go all the way to that point at which it gets too much to bear. But when you're listening to an album like this, you have to feel hopeless. And so this isn't an album that's going to, perk you up on a summer's eve or anything. This is an album that was created for the purpose of trying to replicate something that I don't even know if it exists in the moment. And that is really scary to me. So that should be fun. I wanted to do this little kind of talk because I get a lot of questions every day about things, and this is a little insight, I suppose, into the way in which my mind worked when I was working on all of that stuff. And there's so much more. This is also the first album in maybe forever that no one else has featured on apart from the narrative stuff. The music is 100% mine. Even my little EPs that I've done have always had some sort of external help somewhere, even songs by Benn have. And this is the first time where I can truly say that this is 100% me. Not only 100% me, but 100% me from a sine wave to an album. That's the number one thing that I'm proud of when it comes to this album. When I think of this album, I just think this is so intrinsically linked to me as a human, and it has my ID on it and my own choices. Because when you're building when you're building a synthesis, a sound, you make a lot of choices. That's maybe 100, 200 choices by the time you have a complete sound. And you'll never hear those choices, but I think you can just hear me on it. I just think it's, I don't like to do things that are half-assed, and that's why I quit a lot of projects and never finish things, because I think that what's the point of releasing something that's only a 5 out of 10 when you could just constantly release 10 out of 10s? I don't understand that point, and I've quit, cancelled, done lots of different probably stupid things in terms of financially to projects over the years, where I just think that the integrity of this piece won't last, and that is useless to me. So I want to impart some sort of signature on this album, and I think that I've done that. And I'm not sure that it would have come out like this if I hadn't gone through this kind of process of having to physically get these big synths in and actually learning them, because they are very different. Modular synth is not what I'm used to. So having to learn them, because they don't come with manuals. These are old synths, and they don't come with manuals, so you have to learn from your mistakes. And that's been so exciting. And I just, some of these synths are $60,000. I mean, the ARP ones especially. I think both of them, I think the modular one's actually more, but I think that the actually, I don't know if it is more. I don't know. I'm not sure. But anyway, they're very expensive stuff, and I could never afford them. And so being able to play with all that stuff has just been so much fun. And I've been very lucky with, people helping me along with Mapex, with Ibanez, with Neumann, all of these amazing people who have helped me create this ability, or no, didn't help, but they helped me access this ability to create the music that I want to make in the way that I want it to sound. And that's been truly amazing. And there are a couple of things I'd like to do in the future, and the future's definitely bright. One of them is to do some live shows and to take a lot of these projects on the road and do some live stuff. So hopefully that'll come about in the future. Anyway, I don't know if you've enjoyed this, and if not, then that's fine. But it's a little insight into why this album exists. I don't think I've mentioned the album name yet, which is brilliant. Thank you for listening to me ramble for a bit, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you didn't, then I can't help you with that, because that's the hardest I can punch when it comes to creating an alien-inspired album. That's the hardest I can push. So anyway, thank you guys for listening to me ramble, and